A blood-soaked battlefield where ghostly soldiers linger, a ruined plantation whose overgrown halls are stalked by the dead after dark, and an old church and graveyard harboring a chilling assortment of restless spirits await on this journey through some of the most haunted places in Virginia. Let's jump right in. Our first haunt takes us to North Central Virginia and has us attending Mass at the historic Aquia Church. The Aquia Church, which is located in Stafford County, Virginia, is a historic Episcopal place of worship that's become a popular stop not just for its parishioners for Sunday services, but also to sightseers and history buffs, and to paranormal investigators for a surprisingly chilling host of purported ghostly phenomena that's been experienced within. Historically, this old chapel's roots stretch way back to 1667, with the establishment of a regional congregation who would initially meet in smaller buildings or who would utilize various civic structures after they'd closed for the night. And in 1751, construction of our current church was started. This brand new chapel was an instant hit in the community and would grow into a popular gathering place for politicians, merchants, and farmers alike. Sadly, in 1754, the church would be heavily damaged in a fire, and following fundraising and extensive community efforts in 1757, it was reconstructed in its entirety. Notably, early members of the church were important community leaders, and their parish even included signers of the Leedstown Resolutions, which were precursors to that one little old document known as the Declaration of Independence. Through the War of 1812, a number of churches were destroyed, and even though its sister parish, being the Potomac Church, was among those razed to the ground, the Aquia Church persevered. Similarly, through the Civil War, the church would endure even more abuse as it was occupied by the Union, who utilized it as a stable, hospital, and campsite. And following the war, the community would come together once again in order to refurbish and restore their beloved chapel. As the years sped by, the Aquia Church stood relatively unchanged, and in 1969, it would be placed on the Virginia Landmark Registry and National Registry of Historic Places, and later, in 1991, was also designated a National Historic Landmark. In the present, the Aquia Church remains open to the public and offers Mass every Sunday alongside a host of additional religious services. But as peaceful as this old parish looks, it also harbors a much darker legacy, one wrought with paranormal activity and inexplicable encounters, with both staff and guests reporting disembodied footsteps heard from empty areas at all hours of the day and night, phantom whistling or even snippets of full conversations, and orbs that are usually captured in photography and video. Easily the most famous spirit tied to the Aquia Church is that of a specter known as Blonde Beth. As local legend has it, Beth was the belle of the town, a gorgeous young woman with golden blonde hair. One night, on her way home, she was followed by a group of men, and when she became scared and decided to run, these men began to chase her. It's said that she hid in this very church hoping for safety, but that the men ended up breaking in anyway and murdering her in cold blood. To this day, some tell stories of encounters with a blonde woman with pale skin and blood drenching her clothing that lingers only for a moment before fading away. Our second haunt takes us just to the southwest of our last and has us touring the ever-famous Monticello. Monticello, which is placed in Charlottesville, Virginia, is a massively iconic historic home that once acted as a primary residence to one of our most famous US presidents. That's bounds are popular amongst tourists, history buffs, and for class field trips, and that, more recently, has grown in infamy due to its purported ties to some pretty spooky ghostly activity. Historically, land that would one day hold Monticello was initially inhabited by tribes native to the region, namely by the Monacan, and later, through the early 1700s, it would become part of colonial Virginia's frontier expansion, and was, along with countless acres of surrounding wilderness, divided up between the highest bidders. In 1764, third President of the United States and writer of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, would inherit approximately 5,000 acres from his father, which, in fact, included the hilltop that Monticello would eventually stand upon. And just 4 years later, in 1768, he would start construction of his dream estate at the young age of only 25. Sadly, this construction was carried out on the backs of the enslaved, and the project would be completed enough by 1770 for Jefferson to move in with his family. For a time, Jefferson would serve as a U.S. minister to France, and during his stay in Europe, he would study its various architectures. When he finally returned to Monticello in 1789, he would completely redesign the house, and would upgrade, renovate, and even add entirely new parts to the construct. Like other plantations of the era, Monticello operated on slave labor, and over Jefferson's lifetime alone, more than 600 men and women worked the property, which produced everything from wheat to tobacco. During Jefferson's presidency, which lasted from 1801 to 1809, he would retain Monticello as his primary residence, and following his final term, he would retire to the estate, where he would struggle with financial difficulties due to agricultural instability and his own personal spending. In 1826, Thomas Jefferson would pass on within the confines of Monticello, and following his death, in 1831, the property was sold by Jefferson's daughter, Martha. While it would change hands several times, in 1834, it was purchased by U.S. Navy officer Uriah P. Levi, who would preserve the property and maintain it for its historic significance. Through the Civil War, while Monticello would come under Confederate control as an enemy structure due to the fact that Uriah supported the Union, no damages would be done to it, and it would be returned to the Levi family following the war. Through several generations of Levis, the house was maintained and restored, and in 1923, Monroe Levi would sell the site to the Thomas Jefferson Foundation for $500,000, which today would amount to over $7 million. In 1960, Monticello was designated a U.S. National Historic Landmark. In 1966, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. In 1969, it was added to the Virginia Landmarks Register. And in 1987, it was accepted as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. In the present, Monticello remains open to the public for tours and hosts a range of events, gatherings, and more. Eerily, over its years as a historic museum site, an alarming number of reports of strange or otherworldly happenings have surfaced from both guests and staff members alike, and some of said reports include doors that open and close on their own, extreme cold spots felt through the heat of summer, and phantom wafts of both cooking food and of tobacco smoke. In the parlor, many have complained of sudden bouts of dizziness, while others have told of feeling as if they're being watched by someone or something unseen, and numerous parties swear their personal electronic devices such as phones, tablets, cameras, and whatnot have gone suddenly dead, even on full charges. Easily the most famous apparition encountered at Monticello is that of who else but Thomas Jefferson himself, who has often been observed in passing, muttering to himself, seemingly deep in thought, and who has also been sighted on horseback, crossing the property with an old oil lantern in his outstretched hand. And on to number 3, which takes us just to the south of Alexandria, and on a walk across George Washington's Mount Vernon. George Washington's Mount Vernon Plantation, which is located in Fairfax County, is a sprawling 500-acre expanse topped by an extravagant mansion that's bounds once played home to none other than George Washington himself, and that's since grown in both fame due to its significance in the very forming of our nation, as well as in infamy for its hosting of some of the country's most chilling paranormal activity. Historically, lands that would one day hold Mount Vernon were, for thousands of years, inhabited by tribes native to the region, such as the Piscataway, and amidst colonization in 1674, George Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, would acquire around 5,000 acres along the Potomac, which he would later divide amongst his heirs. In 1726, George Washington's father, Augustine Washington, would begin construction of an estate known then as the Little Hunting Creek Plantation, at which George Washington would spend some of his youth. Following Augustine's passing in 1743, the estate was passed to George's half-brother, Lawrence, who renamed the plantation as Mount Vernon in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon. And following Lawrence's death in 1752, George would begin leasing the property from Lawrence's widow, before, in 1761, acquiring full ownership. Through his ownership, Washington would expand Mount Vernon significantly until it reached more than 8,000 acres, and he would dabble in tobacco, wheat, corn, other grains, and would even construct a grist mill, from which he would become one of the largest whiskey producers in the region. Through the Revolution, Washington would depart Mount Vernon to command the Continental Army, and in his absence, the plantation was managed by his wife Martha, and through his subsequent presidency, the residence would then be maintained by hired management. After acting as our country's first president for 2 successful terms, in 1797, George Washington would retire to Mount Vernon permanently, until his passing in 1799. Following his death, Martha would take over operations on the property until the site was passed to George's nephew, Bushrod. Unfortunately, by the mid-19th century, the estate had drastically declined, and by the 1840s and 50s, the mansion was at risk of being lost. Fortunately, this is when the Mount Vernon Ladies Association stepped in and took over preservation duties of the old plantation, and through the Civil War, both the Union and Confederate armies treated this land as neutral ground, which spared the house from likely total destruction. Towards the end of the 1800s, Mount Vernon would be opened up to the public as a historic site. Through the 20th century, archaeological investigations would form a better understanding of the lives lived at the plantation, and through the 1960s, the whole of the property would be added to the National Register of Historic Places and to the Virginia Landmark Register, while also being designated a National Historic Landmark. In the present, Mount Vernon is still owned and operated by the Ladies Association, and the property offers both guided and self-guided tours, living history demonstrations, seasonal events and reenactments, and educational programs and scholarly research initiatives, alongside a host of additional community gatherings, while remaining one of the most visited historic estates in the US, as well as one of its most haunted. And those who have braved its bounds, especially after dark, have reported instances of objects sighted moving around on their own, footsteps heard from vacant rooms, and accounts of personal electronics going haywire and behaving erratically. Now, not all that surprisingly, the most famous apparition on site is believed to be that of George Washington, who has been sighted in various places across the property, and who is often mistaken for an actor by groups of unsuspecting visitors before they're informed that there's no such actor present. Seemingly one of George's favorite places to materialize is within his old bedroom, where many have recounted observing his apparition. This isn't a new phenomenon either, as sightings of this apparition began in as early as 1890, when 2 women staying in his room reported feeling a presence near in the middle of the night, and then described being startled to the point of screaming when a tall male apparition matching the description of Washington appeared suddenly before them. Lastly, beginning in the 1980s and early 90s, security guards would report instances of the alarm in the stable being triggered, always at the same time at night, and then after a short, set pause, the alarm near Washington's room would also trigger. After a while, those who knew Washington's life well began observing this was happening around the same time he would have been returning home, unsaddling his horse, and heading off to bed. Number 4 has us traveling the coast of Virginia and braving the iconic Rosewell Plantation ruins. The Rosewell Plantation, or what's left of it, which is placed in Virginia's Gloucester County, is an early 18th century ruin and historic site that's become popular amongst both history buffs and ghost hunters alike. That's weathered old mounds purportedly hold supernatural echoes from its lengthy past. Historically, construction of Rosewell was started in 1725 under Man Page, son of Matthew Page of the Page family, which actually boasts the title of being one of the first families in Virginia. And Man's initial aim was to create a lavish mansion that would rival the infinitely impressive Governor's Palace in Williamsburg. Unfortunately, Man would pass on in 1730, after which his widow Judith would inherit the property, and eventually, when their son, Man Page II, came of age, he would oversee remaining construction from that point forward. By the time Man II took over, however, the family was sort of strapped for cash from the funding of the massive build, and he ended up having to sell off most of his land holdings to fund the rest of the project. Following Rosewell's completion, the Page family would reside on the property for over 100 years, until in 1837 they sold the mansion to one Thomas Booth, who in turn made a slew of changes, renovations, and modernizations. The plantation would be passed through various owners, until 1916 when a large fire broke out on site and completely totaled the old estate. Over the years, Rosewell would grow into something of an urban legend. While during the day, historians and curious tourists would find their way onto the property, by night, local youth would sneak out to the decrepit frame and would tell new ghost stories that were all just as much crazier than the last. That the owner was insane and burned the house down intentionally while he was still inside of it. That a serial killer lived there and one of his would-be victims got the better of him. That the site was cursed and it was literally Satan that burned it down. In 1968 and 69 respectively, Rosewell would be added to the Virginia Landmark Register and then to the National Register of Historic Places. In the present, Rosewell remains open to the public as a historic landmark, and as a fun bit of trivia, Governor John Page, who was indeed a member of the Page family, and who was born at Rosewell, was actually close friends with none other than Thomas Jefferson himself, who would frequently visit and stay at the plantation. Now, it's a little known fact that old Tom actually scribbled up a draft of the Declaration of Independence right on site in what was known at the time as the Blue Room, which would have been located on the second story at the northwestern end of the construct. As is tragic fact with most plantations of the era, Rosewell was operated off of slave labor, and not really all that surprisingly, some of its more popular ghost stories tell its bounds are haunted by the restless spirits of those who were forced to give their lives, serving men and women who had no right to call themselves anything more. Those who have braved the old home's bounds, especially after dark, have told of phantom songs and chants heard rising from the surrounding fields, sightings of a spectral servant girl who often is accompanied by the delicious smell of cooking food, and rarer encounters with the small forms of apparitions that appear to be the children of the enslaved, who are normally heard giggling and running about, always just out of view, as if they're hiding. Now, while this has never been confirmed, some darker stories tell that the fire that destroyed Rosewell had to do with a young and beautiful girl enslaved by the Pages, and that she was either separated from the man she loved, or that some sort of affair happened between her and the family. Whatever the case, it resulted in pure resentment between the Pages and this girl, and it's said that she either set the fire that destroyed the mansion, or that she placed a curse upon the property that resulted in the old home's annihilation. Also reported at Rosewell are encounters with a beautiful female apparition suspected to be the ghost of John Page's second wife, American poet Margaret Lowther, who entertained lavish parties at the mansion, and who also raised a total of 12 children. Margaret's manifestation is often described as cheery, and is donning a peaceful smile as she seemingly tends and talks to children that are no longer there. Lastly, one of the eeriest phenomenon reported from Rosewell is that of its mysterious black car. As many shocked eyewitnesses have told it, usually around midnight, an old black car, by some accounts from the 1930s, rolls up to the ruins and parks for a little while. Most who have encountered it describe feeling suddenly so scared that they're never able to approach it, and the one man who did, a man by the name of Raymond West, said that the window slowly rolled down, and that the ashen gray face of a woman with coal-black hair and wide pale eyes suddenly leaned into view, and stared at him and a friend that he was with without blinking. West and his companion eventually lost this unnerving staring contest, and ended up leaving. However, when they returned the next day, there was no sign the car had ever been there, much less tire tracks. Saving the spookiest for last, our fifth and final haunt lands us on the infamous Cold Harbor battlefield. The Cold Harbor battlefield and its associated cemetery, visitors center, facilities, and more, all of which are located in Hanover County in Virginia, include a roughly 500-acre expanse of protected land that draws in countless visitors each and every year, some of whom that leave with chilling ghost stories of their own. Historically, as the Civil War ripped its way across the not-so-United States of America, in 1864, Ulysses S. Grant had been promoted to General-in-Chief of the Union Army and would work directly with the Army of the Potomac. With the freedom to finally operate of his own accord, the new but very experienced general would design what is now known as Grant's Overland Campaign, which aimed to ensure that the opposition's General Lee was under constant engagement, while also preventing Confederate maneuvering and grinding down its manpower en route to the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, which, might I add, he aimed to capture. Following a series of serious engagements, unlike Union generals before him, Grant would continue to move his army southeast towards Richmond to keep the pressure on Lee. As the two armies marched toward the same endpoint, they would meet at an unassuming crossroad near Chickahominy River known as what else but Cold Harbor. Notably, Confederate forces would arrive to the battlefield first and would begin fortifying their positions, and when Union forces joined the party, they would entrench a line directly opposite of the Confederacy. Oh, and it's important to mention that this battle would actually rely heavily on trench-style warfare. The Battle of Cold Harbor would rage from May 31st through June 12th, and would include 13 days of some of the war's most brutal combat. When all was said and done, there were around 17,000 to 18,000 shared casualties, and while the history books state that General Lee took the victory, in reality, that's not so much the case. See, Lee took the win as far as numbers and deflecting Grant's assault. However, Grant did the same thing he'd ordered before. Instead of retreating to the north, he just kept on pushing south. Now, why this is so significant is because he was essentially breaking every tactic that previous generals had followed. He knew that no matter how the cards were cut, the Union Army was more than double the size of the Confederacy. So, at the end of the day, the only way they could win was familiarity with the terrain and tactics. And giving Lee time to plan was only adding to an advantage that shouldn't have existed in the first place. By keeping pressure moving into the South, Grant forced Lee's hand into a series of engagements that would ultimately lead to his defeat. So, long story short, you decide who the winner was. Through many different eras, the Cold Harbor battlefield was certainly recognized, but it would namely draw interest from those who happened to cross it, unlike other sites such as the much more renowned Gettysburg battlefield. However, in 1936, it would be officiated as part of Richmond National Battlefield Park, and much more recently, in 1995, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Today, as part of the larger battlefield park, Cold Harbor hosts all sorts of events, including festivals, artillery demonstrations, reenactments, fairs, and other themed gatherings, and offers several touring options. And though to us, closing in on 2 centuries later, the site inspires the imagination and acts more as a form of attraction, it's important to remember its bloody and undoubtedly gruesome past. The very past that some say seeps from the afterlife into our world, in the form of spine-tingling paranormal activity, including phantom gun and cannon fire that emanates from thin air, disturbing moans, groans, and screams that flit on the winds, and even encounters with a handful of ghostly soldiers, or the witnessing of full-scale battles that, to the unsuspecting, seem to be reenactments, before everything vanishes in the blink of an eye. One of the most popular scary stories surrounding Cold Harbor is that of its ghostly little girl, who is usually described as somewhere between 8 and 12 years in age, and is clad in a white dress as she walks and skips around either the battlefield or through the nearby cemetery. While nothing is known for certain about this girl, some have theorized that this small spirit belonged to someone who lived in one of the houses caught in the pandemonium, and that she was either killed by a stray bullet or permanently traumatized from witnessing so much death and violence. Additionally, all throughout the cemetery are reports of orbs or odd lantern-like glows visible to the naked eye, shadowy figures sighted walking slowly amongst the headstones after dark, and even instances in which bystanders have sworn they've heard the hoofbeats and creaking of old horse-drawn carriages, and have even discovered fresh hoofprints in the nearby mud when no horses were present. Lastly, during the Civil War, a number of freestanding structures were commandeered and used as field hospitals. Such is the case with the old Garthright House, where God knows how many soldiers endured near torturous procedures or amputations, or lost their lives. Near this house after dark, those passing by have told of blood-curdling screams from within, and the few who have braved entering the house on tours have told of disturbing instances in which all of the walls begin leaking blood. Thanks for joining me on this adventure through some of the most haunted places in Virginia. If you enjoyed hearing my histories and ghost stories, subscribe to my channel, throw this upload a like, and share me with anyone you feel could use a good scare. I'll see you all next time.